Imagine if African countries possessed nuclear weapons. Would it result in increased power and respect for African leaders? The answer is affirmative. Africa comprises 54 countries, yet its presidents often lack respect and attention from the international community. They are frequently disregarded, mistreated, and even referred to as servants when summoned to the US or Europe. Nevertheless, Professor Patrick Locke Ochino Lumumba, a lawyer and pan-Africanist, occasionally contemplates the idea of Africa having nuclear weapons. He believes that if Africa possessed such weaponry, Western leaders would think twice before making derogatory remarks about the continent. However, it is important to clarify that Africa is not actively pursuing nuclear weapons. Professor Lumumba advocates for a united Africa without borders between its countries. He envisions a return to Africa's historical state, which existed for thousands of years before European colonial powers arrived, enslaved people, and divided the continent by drawing arbitrary lines on its map to create and divide countries based on their interests. It is ironic that Europe decided the fate of a whole continent without consulting its inhabitants. Even though colonialism and slavery formally ended, Africa still faces a modern form of exploitation known as neocolonialism. African countries continue to struggle against this system, which suppresses their independence whenever they strive for full autonomy. The ease of Western interference and intervention in Africa can be attributed to the absence of fear regarding African sovereignty. Western countries openly exploit and interfere, knowing they will face no consequences. This is where Lumumba's concept of Africa possessing nuclear weapons emerges. He suggests that such possession would create a deterrent effect, making Western powers think twice before exploiting or interfering in Africa. Lumumba's statements have caused significant impact in the Western world. He asserts that the roots of exploitation in Africa can be traced back to slavery, which gradually evolved into colonization. The Berlin Conference serves as a notable example, where European powers gathered to divide the African continent into spheres of influence. This division occurred due to the allure of colonization, driven by various realities and agitation from the continent. Nevertheless, Africa eventually regained its independence. Renowned African-American scholar John Henrik Clarke emphasized that Africa's independence was restored by mimicking European governance systems. However, Clarke pointed out that no African country could truly thrive solely based on those systems. Subsequently, a new neocolonial project emerged, as described by Kwame Nkrumah in his book Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. Today, we find ourselves in a new colonial stage characterized by cunning actions from European and American powers. Lumumba highlights that Western interference was evident during the G7 summit in Hiroshima, manifested through military training, diplomatic maneuvers, economic infrastructure control, dollarization, and influence in education. This neocolonial project persists through institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, as well as organizations like UKAID and the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, which act as Trojan horses, influencing Africa's systems and infiltrating its institutions. The interference extends to post-colonial institutions such as the Commonwealth of Independent Nations, where former French-speaking nations lack true sovereignty. To confront this situation, Africans must recognize the ongoing neocolonial threats. President Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana issued a warning in 1963, emphasizing the need for unity to resist military, economic, agricultural, and health interference. Approaching the 60th anniversary of this crucial moment, the call for African unity becomes more pressing than ever. PLO Lumumba stated that it is our responsibility to truly give meaning to Africa's agenda in 2063, infuse life into the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and revive declarations such as the Malabo Declaration, the Maputo Declaration, and the Yamoussoukro Declaration. In simpler terms, Lumumba emphasizes that as Africans, We need to stop operating in isolation. Relying on Rwanda alone or Burundi alone won't suffice. By collaborating through regional bodies and ultimately the African Union, we might indeed succeed in overcoming this significant challenge. It's crucial to recognize that it's not just Europe involved. There is a new scramble for Africa with the involvement of China, Turkey, and other actors. The presence of military bases serves as a clear warning that adherence is expected, or force may be employed. What rattled Western parliaments was Lumumba's statement that he sometimes genuinely wishes Africa also had nuclear weapons because that's the language Europe and America comprehend. Lumumba emphasizes that the impact of European, American, Russian, and Chinese interference is an ongoing issue, not merely a historical one. Mentioning entities like NOAs is intended to highlight their role in keeping Africans in a perpetual state of dependency. Lumumba stresses that we are not advocating for isolation. Rather, we need to define how we engage with the world. As individual countries, we are vulnerable, and the world tends to deal with us in that weakened state. For example, the United States engages with Rwanda on matters like second-hand clothing, while other countries like Burundi, Kenya, and Uganda face their own challenges. However, when we come together as East Africa with a population of 300 million people, we gain strength and become a more formidable force. This is the core of our message. Lumumba points out that it is crucial to acknowledge our internal shortcomings as we move forward. Our weakness, as he bluntly states, stems from a glaring issue in political leadership. Many African political leaders can be deemed thieves, and it's time we call them by that name. These individuals are not genuinely concerned about the country's interests. As long as we keep electing such figures into positions of power across Africa, they will remain susceptible to manipulation. So what should Africans do, according to Lumumba? Put simply, we must make demands. Lumumba has penned numerous letters to the chairman, addressing the role of the African Union in peacemaking. He advocates for a proactive African Union that is not summoned by Americans and Saudis, but is united in its purpose. In essence, Lumumba states that we have a responsibility to ourselves, both at the leadership level and within civic society. We must engage positively and consistently voice our concerns without diplomatic conveniences, as diplomacy can soothe us into a false sense of security. Lastly, when foreign powers extend their influence, we must always recall the Trojan War proverb. Even when Greeks bear gifts, they do not have our best interests at heart. The sooner Africans recognize external threats and domestic weaknesses, the safer it will be. As Lumumba said, if you ask 10 Kenyans, possibly only one knows they are in Kenya. Soon they will be heading to Burundi. If you ask the average African about Africa Agenda 2063, you'll likely find that only 2 out of 10 are aware of it. Similarly, if you inquire about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, you'll be lucky if 2 out of 10 know about it. Africa's situation is unfavorable, and we must have honest discussions about it. When it comes to the funding of the African Union, around 60% of the budget likely comes from external sources. It's a reality that whoever finances a project has a significant say in its direction. This is the way things work in the world. PLO Lumumba emphasized the need for us to take charge of our initiatives to gain understanding and respect. As early as 1980, under the Lagos Plan of Action, Africa recognized the need for a master plan to boost intra-African trade and engagement. Although the Lagos Plan of Action faced challenges, Africa Agenda 2063 essentially revisits that plan. In essence, Africa acknowledges the importance of defining itself and its agenda, which is a significant development. People have become more aware and now understand what has been happening in their countries. They know how their countries were kept as servants and exploited even after gaining independence. In 2005, former British Prime Minister Tony Blair assembled a group of individuals for the Our Common Interest report on the African Commission. Blair, who served as the president of the European Union and the G8 at that time, produced the report. The current operations of the Blair Institute in Africa seem to align with what was outlined in that report. This report demonstrates how Europeans pursued their own interests, coating it in sugar and camouflage to deceive Africa. They created an environment that favored foreign companies, but ultimately harmed the continent. While some engagements may mislead us with a false sense of security, we can't solely blame the West for all the exploitation. The West can be partly blamed, but in general, you can't blame a monster for killing a lion that is separated from its pride. If the lions were united, the master could have never approached and benefited. That's why PLO Lumumba stressed the need to decolonize all learning. There's a saying that the happiness of the slave is the comfort of the slave owner. If Africa doesn't recognize this, we will never realize our potential. Another saying goes, if you behave like grass, the elephants will eat you. In many instances, we in the African continent act like grass fit for consumption. Moving forward, it is crucial for Africa to recognize that there is a new scramble for the continent, sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle. PLO Lumumba highlighted that Russian, American, Chinese, French, and Turkish officials were all present in the continent within a 2-year period. What were they seeking? Their best interests lie in engaging smaller countries and avoiding associations like the East African Community, African Union, and ECOWAS. When these larger entities are united, they are not easily manipulated. PLO Lumumba pointed out that African heads of state and government were deliberately summoned to Washington, D.C. last year. After the president's address and photo session, Africa was granted $60 billion for 54 countries. Subsequently, the American president initiated bilateral agreements with Burundi and Kenya. In terms of semantics, it's important to consider the language used to define interference. Many times, we find ourselves restricted by Portuguese, French, English, or other colonial languages used in our engagements. History has repeatedly shown that interference, even with noble intentions initially, can take a turn for the worst once the proverbial Trojan horse is inside, as seen in the case of Libya. PLO Lumumba emphasized the importance of recognizing the current situations in the Central African Republic and Somalia. He highlighted that even though good intentions may be present initially, the outcomes speak for themselves. Lumumba used the analogy of a tree being judged by its fruits, stating that a mango claiming to be an orange is still fundamentally a mango. Lumumba also drew attention to the British strategy of dividing and ruling, fostering ethnic animosity in regions like the Banda Kingdom in Uganda and various kingdoms in Kenya, including the Maasai. He questioned what Africans should do when Western countries interfere, noting that foreign interference is not always obvious, but can have far-reaching consequences due to the nature of the system. Lumumba pointed out Africa's lack of meaningful participation in institutions such as the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, and the IMF. These institutions were established in 1944 by British and American economists after World War II to aid in Europe's recovery through the Marshall Plan. He expressed concern about Africa's dependency on these institutions and highlighted the issues with the IMF's one-size-fits-all prescriptions, as seen in the unfavorable outcomes of structural adjustments in the 1980s. Lumumba emphasized that Africa had minimal involvement in shaping this economic architecture, which has put the continent at a disadvantage. Lumumba highlighted that the World Trade Organization, initially part of the United Nations in 1945, is designed in a way that does not favor Africa. The prevailing notion is that Africa continues to be a producer of primary goods while consuming items with added value. Africa has undertaken various initiatives to address this, including the African, Pacific, Caribbean, and Pacific Loma Conventions, but these have been influenced externally. Lumumba mentioned the Lagos Plan of Action in 1980, which aimed to boost trade engagement, but fell short of its goals. He emphasized that a united government is seen as a solution, referencing Kwame Nkrumah's vision of one government, one army, and one foreign policy for Africa. Lumumba mentioned Africa Agenda 2063, which outlines the aspirations of the African Union to defend against foreign interference. He highlighted that smaller nations face inequality in negotiations, as meetings like the G7 and G20 often exclude them. Lumumba stressed the necessity of unity for African nations in negotiations. Regarding African history, Lumumba expressed concern about the diminishing emphasis on history in many African countries' curricula. He noted the critical role of history, particularly the history of pan-African movements, in understanding the continent's past and fostering awareness. Lumumba called for a reassessment of the curriculum in higher learning institutions, advocating for the reintroduction of pan-Africanism to instill a sense of identity and purpose among the youth. He emphasized the importance of indoctrinating the younger generation with pan-African ideals to drive initiatives like Africa Agenda 2063 forward. Lumumba then discussed the historical example of South Africa's development of nuclear weapons. South Africa began exploring nuclear weapons in 1948 through the South African Atomic Energy Corporation, which oversaw uranium mining and industrial trade. In 1957, South Africa collaborated with the United States through the Atoms for Peace program, acquiring a nuclear research reactor and highly enriched uranium fuel. During the apartheid era from the 1960s to the 1990s, South Africa conducted research on weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. However, South Africa's nuclear weapons doctrine was primarily aimed at political leverage rather than actual battlefield deployment. The objective was to persuade the United States to intervene in regional conflicts involving South Africa and the Soviet Union or its proxies. By the late 1980s, South Africa had secretly assembled 6 nuclear weapons to establish a minimum credible deterrent. The country identified a test site in the Kalahari Desert and established a high-security weapons research and development facility at Pelindaba. However, due to international pressure and concerns about diplomatic relations and contracts, South Africa voluntarily dismantled all its nuclear weapons in the 1990s. South Africa has since become a signatory to various arms control treaties, including the Biological Weapons Convention in 1975 and the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons in 1991. In 2019, South Africa ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, solidifying its commitment as the first nation to possess, disarm, and sign the treaty. There are different arguments regarding why South Africa chose to give up its nuclear weapons. Some suggest that Western powers, particularly the United States and its allies, exerted imperialistic pressure to maintain their dominance and control over global nuclear capabilities. Another perspective proposes that neocolonial interests influenced the decision, with Western powers aiming to ensure post-apartheid South Africa remained under their influence. South Africa's decision to give up its nuclear weapons was influenced by external factors. Economic and political interests of Western powers played a significant role, as they demanded South Africa abandon its nuclear program as a condition for alignment and to alleviate economic pressure. Economic sanctions were used as a coercive tool by Western nations. Some argue that the West, particularly the United States, aimed to maintain global nuclear dominance and control by pressuring South Africa. Another perspective is that South Africa made the decision voluntarily. The country's forces were concerned about the perceived risk of communism spreading in southern Africa, particularly with Cuban forces supporting Marxist-Leninist revolutionary groups in Angola. This posed a threat to Namibia, leading to South Africa engaging in the Tripartite Accord with Cuba and Angola in 1988. The result was the withdrawal of both South African and Cuban troops from Angola and the independence of Namibia. Dismantling nuclear weapons was seen as a proactive step toward regional stability, peace, and restoring South Africa's credibility in regional and international politics. South Africa officially terminated its nuclear weapons program in 1989, dismantling all 7 bombs. It then joined the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons in 1991. The decision was seen as a significant move towards regional stability and non-proliferation. Let's conclude with this question. Should African countries develop nuclear weapons? Would nuclear weapons give them more power, respect, and bargaining leverage? The comment section is open for you to express thoughts on whether North Korea's Kim Jong-un would be feared and respected without nuclear weapons.